The first thing they teach you in post-anesthesia care is that patients say strange things when waking up. The medications we use to induce unconsciousness, propofol, sevoflurane, desflurane, don't wear off cleanly. In my 14 years as a PACU nurse at Mercy General Hospital in Portland, Oregon, I've heard patients sing opera, confess to crimes that never happened, and describe elaborate hallucinations. I've seen patients wake up laughing, crying, combative, and everything in between. What follows is the case that fundamentally challenged my understanding of consciousness and anesthesia. It ultimately led me to leave PACU nursing and continues to affect me deeply. The case began on March 8, 2022, during a routine Tuesday morning shift. The patient was Vincent Ashford, a 43-year-old high school mathematics teacher scheduled for a straightforward laparoscopic cholecystectomy, gallbladder removal. His preoperative workup was completely normal. He was healthy, with no significant medical history. His anesthesiologist, Dr. Felix Harrington, had 22 years of experience. The surgery was expected to last 60 to 90 minutes. Vincent's surgery began at 7:45 a.m. and went exceptionally well. At 9:07 a.m., he arrived in my care, still deeply sedated. His vital signs were perfect. Heart rate 68 beats per minute, blood pressure 118/72, oxygen saturation 98%. Everything progressed normally until 9:48 a.m., when Vincent's eyes opened and he spoke. "Catherine," he said, his voice clear and urgent, not the slurred confusion typical of post-anesthesia patients. "I need to tell you something very important. I need you to listen carefully because I don't know how long I have to explain this." His tone was unsettling. His eyes were wide and focused, displaying an intensity unusual for a patient immediately post-surgery. "Vincent, you just had surgery," I said gently. "You're going to feel confused for a little while as the anesthesia wears off." "No," Vincent said firmly. "I'm not confused. I went under anesthesia at 7:45 this morning. Dr. Kimball was my surgeon. Dr. Harrington was my anesthesiologist. It's Tuesday, March 8th, 2022. I'm 43 years old. I teach at Westview High School. I'm married to Claire, and we have 2 daughters, Audrey and Sophie. I am not confused." I stood very still. Vincent's level of orientation was remarkable for someone who should still be emerging from general anesthesia. But what disturbed me more was the desperate urgency in his voice. "During the surgery, I was conscious," Vincent continued. "I was aware. But not in the operating room. I was somewhere else. My professional training kicked in. Anesthesia awareness is one of the most feared complications in surgery, when a patient regains consciousness while paralyzed, unable to move or communicate. But Dr. Harrington had been monitoring Vincent continuously. Any signs of consciousness would have been immediately apparent. "What do you mean, somewhere else?" I asked, reaching for the call button to summon Dr. Harrington. When the propofol hit, I counted backwards from 10 and got to 7. Then everything went dark, but I didn't lose consciousness. I was falling through black space. Then suddenly, I was in a place, an actual place. "Can you describe it?" "It was like a waiting room," Vincent said. "Everything was white, walls, floor, ceiling, but glowing from within. There were chairs arranged in rows, all facing a wall that pulsed with faint blue light. And there were other people there, sitting in the chairs, just waiting, none of them moving or talking. I'd heard patients describe hallucinations before, but Vincent's description had an unusual specificity that made it feel different." "Did you recognize any of them?" "My grandfather, Terrence Ashford. He died when I was 16 in 1995. He was sitting in one of those chairs, staring forward, not acknowledging me at all. I called his name, touched his shoulder. Nothing." Vincent gripped the bed rails tightly. "Catherine, every single person in that room was dead. My high school friend Troy Beckman, who died in a car accident in 2003. Mrs. Holloway, my ninth grade English teacher. She died of cancer in 2008. My wife's Uncle Gerald, who had a stroke last year. Dr. Harrington arrived and I quickly briefed him. He listened with professional concern, then explained to Vincent that anesthesia can cause vivid dreams that feel real but aren't. "Then explain this," Vincent said. "In that waiting room, I saw someone I didn't recognize. A young man, early 20s, red hair and freckles. He was wearing a green t-shirt with a logo on it. He was the only one who seemed almost aware. His eyes were moving slightly, like he was dreaming, even though he was sitting upright." "Vincent," Dr. Harrington began. I watched him for several minutes. Then suddenly he gasped, this huge, sharp breath, and his eyes opened wide. He looked directly at me, terrified, and said, "They brought me back. Oh God, they brought me back." Then I was falling again, and then I woke up here. Dr. Harrington and I exchanged glances. In 14 years, I had never had a patient make such specific, testable claims. "That young man is here," Vincent insisted, "in this hospital. Right now. Red hair, freckles, green t-shirt. He was dead or close to death, and they resuscitated him. If I'm hallucinating, how would I know such specific details about a real person?" After medicating Vincent with lorazepam and transferring him to a surgical floor room, I couldn't shake his story. During my lunch break, against my better judgment, I searched our electronic medical record system for male patients aged 20 to 25, admitted within the past 48 hours. The fourth result made my hands start trembling. Daniel Orson, a 23-year-old male, brought to our emergency department at 11:47 p.m. on March 7th, hours before Vincent's surgery, found unresponsive in his apartment. Paramedics performed CPR for 14 minutes before achieving return of spontaneous circulation. Admitted to ICU with cardiac arrest of unknown etiology. The admission photograph showed a young man with bright red hair and freckles. According to the paramedic report, when found unresponsive, he'd been wearing a green Portland Trail Blazers t-shirt. And the ICU notes indicated Daniel had opened his eyes for the first time that morning at 9:30 a.m., just before Vincent woke up in PACU at 9:48 a.m. Vincent had described this patient with impossible accuracy, a patient he couldn't possibly have seen or known about. I sat in the stairwell, unable to breathe properly. Vincent's description was too specific to be coincidental. The red hair, the freckles, the green shirt, the timing of Daniel opening his eyes. The words, "They brought me back." On March 11th, I made a decision that crossed professional boundaries. I visited Daniel in the post-cardiac arrest unit and asked about his recovery experience. "I don't remember much," Daniel said. His voice was still hoarse from intubation. "I remember feeling dizzy, then waking up here. Everything in between is just gone." "Do you remember any dreams while you were unconscious?" I asked carefully. Daniel was quiet, then said, "Actually, there was something. Probably just a weird dream from the medications, but I was in this strange room. Everything was white, like a sterile waiting room. There were chairs arranged in rows, and I was sitting in one. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I could just sit there staring at a wall glowing with faint blue light. There were other people there too, sitting in chairs, but nobody was talking. My hands had gone numb. "How long did you feel like you were there?" I managed to ask. "No idea. Time felt weird. Could have been minutes or hours. I just remember sitting there, unable to move, staring at that wall. Then suddenly I felt like I could breathe again, this huge, desperate breath. And I was so scared because I realized I hadn't been breathing before. There was someone standing next to me, a middle-aged man staring at me with this shocked expression. And then I woke up in the ICU. "Did you say anything to him?" "Yes," Daniel said. I was so confused and scared. I just blurted out, "They brought me back." Oh God. They brought me back. I left his room as calmly as I could, but once in the stairwell, my legs wouldn't hold me. Everything Vincent had described had been real. The white waiting room, the chairs, the pulsing blue wall, the exact moment when Daniel opened his eyes, the exact words he spoke. On March 18th, I received a call from Dr. Lawrence Henriksen, a cardiologist from Salem Hospital, 45 miles south of Portland. He had a patient named Grace Ashford Tennant, Vincent's sister-in-law, who had experienced something identical during conscious sedation for a cardiac procedure. Grace described the same white room, the same chairs, the same pulsing blue wall. She reported seeing multiple deceased relatives, and she saw Vincent there, described him perfectly. Vincent had told her, "You can see me. You're not supposed to be here yet. You're still alive." 3 patients, 3 separate procedures, 3 identical descriptions of the same impossible place, and Vincent and Grace had seen each other there. Over the following weeks, I became increasingly dysfunctional at work. I couldn't administer pre-medication without wondering if I was sending patients to that white waiting room. When patients emerged from anesthesia, I would lean close and ask if they'd seen a white room, deceased people, a pulsing blue wall. In early April, I was called into a meeting with Dr. Crane and our nurse manager. I broke down and told them everything. They were concerned about my mental state and recommended medical leave. I took their advice and went on leave April 15th, 2022. In June, I met with Vincent at a coffee shop. He looked healthy, but when he talked about the white waiting room, I could see the lasting impact. "I know what I saw," Vincent told me. "Everyone there was dead. And the fact that Grace saw me there when she was under sedation, that's confirmation." "What do you think that place is?" I asked. "I think it's where consciousness goes when it's disconnected from the body, but the person isn't quite dead yet. Like a waiting area between life and death. Most people there were fully dead, which is why they couldn't move. But people like me and Grace, temporarily unconscious from anesthesia, we could still move around. And Daniel was dying, which is why he was stuck until they resuscitated him." Vincent leaned forward. "While I was there, I walked to that blue pulsing wall. When I touched it, I felt this overwhelming sense of finality, like that wall was the actual boundary between life and death. And on the other side, I could hear things, voices, echoes of consciousness. Everyone who had ever died was on the other side, and they were still aware somehow. Death isn't an ending, it's just a transition. I never returned to work at Mercy General. In July 2022, I submitted my resignation and took a position doing telephone triage, work where I'd never have to put another patient under anesthesia. The case still haunts me. I think about it every day. I wonder how many patients visit that waiting room without remembering afterward. I wonder about the people sitting motionless in those white chairs, whether they know they're dead, whether they're experiencing time passing. And I wonder what exists beyond that pulsing blue wall. The medical community has no framework for what Vincent, Daniel, and Grace experienced. Anesthesia is supposed to simply suppress consciousness, not transport it somewhere else. Consciousness is supposed to be generated by brain activity, not exist independently. But I know what I documented. Vincent described Daniel with impossible accuracy before having any way to know about him. Grace saw Vincent in the same location. All 3 provided consistent, specific details about a place that shouldn't exist. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed and studied this phenomenon more systematically. But I couldn't continue in a field where every time I helped put a patient under, I was consumed by the question of where their consciousness was actually going. Every day, thousands of people undergo anesthesia. They're told they'll simply go to sleep and wake up when surgery is finished. But what if that's not accurate? What if consciousness goes somewhere during that period, somewhere we don't understand and can't monitor? The impossible case of Vincent Gregory Ashford will haunt me for the rest of my life, not because of what it reveals about anesthesia, but because of what it suggests about consciousness and death. If consciousness persists independently of brain function, then every assumption modern medicine makes might be fundamentally incorrect. I think about that white waiting room constantly. And sometimes, in quiet moments before I fall asleep, I wonder if I'll find myself there someday, sitting in one of those white chairs, unable to move, staring at that pulsing blue wall, waiting for whatever comes next. This is obviously anesthesia-related confusion with some elements of fixation, Dr. Harrington said quietly. But his level of clarity and orientation is unusual. I want to give him 1 milligram of lorazepam IV to help with anxiety, and we should definitely get a psych consult before discharge. Have you noticed any other signs of emergence delirium? No, I admitted. He's unusually lucid. His vital signs are stable. He's oriented to person, place, time, and situation. If it weren't for the content of what he's saying, I would assess him as having an unremarkable emergence. Let's continue monitoring closely, Dr. Harrington said. I'll document the anesthesia awareness concern, but I'm confident there was no actual awareness. I'll check back in an hour. I returned to Vincent's bedside to administer the lorazepam and provide post-operative instructions, but I found myself unable to shake his story from my mind. The specificity of his description of the red-haired young man bothered me. It would be easy to dismiss Vincent's experience entirely as an anesthesia dream, but something about his desperate certainty made me uncomfortable. Over the next hour, Vincent remained stable, but increasingly quiet. The lorazepam had calmed his anxiety somewhat, but he continued to insist that his experience had been real. At 11:05 a.m., he was transferred to a surgical floor room for continued recovery and observation before his planned discharge the following morning. I should have forgotten about Vincent's case and moved on to my other patients. In a busy PACU, there simply isn't time to dwell on unusual patient statements. But I couldn't stop thinking about his description of the red-haired young man who had been brought back. The detail was too specific, too testable. Against my better judgment, and during my lunch break at 12:30 p.m., I decided to check something. Our hospital's electronic medical record system includes a feature that allows staff to search for patients by various criteria. I felt slightly guilty for what I was about to do, looking up patient information out of curiosity rather than direct clinical need, but I told myself I was simply ruling out a coincidence that would help me better understand Vincent's anesthesia experience. I searched for male patients between ages 20 and 25 who had been admitted to Mercy General within the past 48 hours. The search returned 6 results. I reviewed each patient's chart briefly, and what I found made my hands start trembling. The 4th patient on the list was named Daniel Orson, a 23-year-old male who had been brought to our emergency department at 11:47 p.m. on March 7th, the previous night, just hours before Vincent's surgery. According to the emergency department notes, Daniel had been found unresponsive in his apartment by his roommate. Paramedics had performed CPR for 14 minutes before achieving return of spontaneous circulation. He had been admitted to our intensive care unit with a diagnosis of cardiac arrest of unknown etiology. The ICU admission photograph in Daniel's chart showed a young man with bright red hair, freckles, and the pale, distinctive appearance of someone who had recently been critically ill. He was currently intubated and sedated, but showing signs of neurological recovery. The ICU notes indicated that he had opened his eyes briefly that morning and had made some purposeful movements in response to stimulation. I sat staring at the computer screen, my lunch completely forgotten. Vincent had described this patient with impossible accuracy. A young man in his early 20s with red hair and freckles who had been brought back after being dead or nearly dead. The match was too specific to be coincidental, but the detail that made my blood run cold was something Vincent couldn't possibly have known. According to the paramedic report attached to Daniel's chart, when he was found unresponsive, he had been wearing a green t-shirt with the logo of the Portland Trail Blazers basketball team. I closed the patient chart quickly, as if I had seen something I wasn't supposed to see. My rational mind tried to explain what I had just discovered. Perhaps Vincent had somehow seen Daniel being brought into the hospital the previous night. Perhaps he had overheard hospital staff discussing the case. Perhaps it was simply a remarkable coincidence. Red-haired young men are not that uncommon after all. But these explanations felt hollow. Vincent had been at home the previous night and had arrived at the hospital at 6:15 a.m. for his 7:45 a.m. surgery. Daniel had been admitted directly to the ICU, which was on a different floor from the surgical check-in area. There was no plausible way Vincent could have seen Daniel or known about his case before going under anesthesia. I spent the rest of my shift in a state of increasing anxiety. I found myself making errors in documentation that I had to correct, missing subtle changes in my patient's conditions that I normally would have caught immediately, and generally functioning well below my usual standard of care. My mind kept returning to Vincent's description of the white waiting room filled with dead people, and to his claim that he had seen Daniel there right before Daniel came back. At 4:30 p.m., I made a decision that I knew was professionally inappropriate, but that I felt compelled to make anyway. I went to the ICU on the 4th floor and asked the charge nurse if I could briefly observe Daniel Orson's care, claiming that I was interested in learning more about post-cardiac arrest management because I occasionally received such patients in PACU after surgical procedures. The ICU nurse, a colleague I knew casually named Bridget O'Hare, was happy to discuss Daniel's case. She explained that his cardiac arrest had been unexpected. He had no known heart problems, and no obvious cause for his collapse had been identified. He had been cooled to 33 degrees Celsius for 24 hours as part of therapeutic hypothermia protocol to protect his brain, and he was now being slowly rewarmed. The medical team was cautiously optimistic about his neurological recovery based on his examination findings. "Has he been conscious at all?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Has he said anything?" "He's still intubated," Bridget explained, "but he opened his eyes this morning around 9:30 and seemed to track movement. Dr. Wesley thinks we might be able to extubate him tomorrow if he continues to improve." "Why do you ask?" "Just curious about the timeline of neurological recovery," I said, but my mind was racing. Vincent had seen the red-haired young man open his eyes and speak to him during Vincent's anesthesia experience. According to the ICU documentation, Daniel had actually opened his eyes for the first time at 9:30 a.m., which was just before Vincent woke up in PACU at 9:48 a.m. I thanked Bridget and returned to PACU, where I finished my shift in a daze. That evening, I drove home to the apartment I shared with my partner, Alex, and tried to act normal. But I couldn't eat dinner, couldn't focus on conversation, couldn't think about anything except Vincent's white waiting room and the impossible connection to Daniel Orson. Over the next 3 days, I became quietly obsessed with both cases. I checked Vincent's chart repeatedly and noted that he had been discharged on March 9th in good physical condition, though the psychiatric consultant had documented concerns about possible anesthesia-related psychosis and had recommended outpatient follow-up. I also tracked Daniel's progress. He was successfully extubated on March 10th and was showing excellent neurological recovery with no apparent brain damage from his cardiac arrest. On March 11th, during my lunch break, I made another decision that crossed professional boundaries. I went to the post-cardiac arrest unit where Daniel had been transferred and asked if I could speak with him briefly about his recovery experience for educational purposes. The nurse caring for Daniel that day was someone I didn't know well, which made it easier to present my request as a professional learning opportunity rather than a personal obsession. Daniel was sitting up in bed, looking remarkably healthy for someone who had been clinically dead just 4 days earlier. His red hair was messy and his face was still pale, but his eyes were bright and alert. I introduced myself as a PACU nurse interested in learning about patient experiences during cardiac arrest. "I don't remember much," Daniel said, his voice still slightly hoarse from the breathing tube that had been removed. "I remember feeling dizzy in my apartment, and then I remember waking up here in the hospital. Everything in between is just gone." "Do you remember any dreams or sensations while you were unconscious?" I asked, trying to keep my tone professionally curious rather than desperately eager. Daniel was quiet for a moment, and his expression shifted to something more uncertain. Actually, there was something, but it was probably just a weird dream from all the medications or the hypothermia protocol or whatever. "What did you experience?" I asked, my heart pounding. "I was in this strange room," Daniel said slowly. "Everything was white, like a really sterile waiting room. There were chairs arranged in rows, and I was sitting in one of them. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could just sit there staring forward at this wall that seemed to be glowing with a faint blue light. And there were other people there too, sitting in the other chairs, but nobody was talking or acknowledging each other." My hands had gone numb. I forced myself to breathe normally and keep my expression neutral and interested rather than terrified. "How long did you feel like you were in this room?" I asked. "I have no idea," Daniel said. Time felt weird there. It could have been minutes or hours or days. I just remember sitting there, unable to move, unable to do anything but stare at that wall. And then suddenly, I felt like I could breathe again, this huge, desperate breath. And I was so scared because I realized I hadn't been breathing before. And there was someone standing next to me, a middle-aged man, and he was staring at me with this shocked expression. And then I woke up here in the ICU. "Did the man say anything to you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "No," Daniel said, "but I said something to him. I was so confused and scared, and I just blurted out, 'They brought me back. Oh God, they brought me back.' And then everything went dark again, and when I woke up the second time, I was here with all these tubes in me and nurses everywhere." I thanked Daniel for sharing his experience and left his room as calmly as I could manage. But once I was in the stairwell, I had to sit down on the steps because my legs wouldn't hold me anymore. Everything Vincent had described had been real. The white waiting room, the other people sitting in chairs, the pulsing blue wall, and most impossibly, the specific moment when Daniel had opened his eyes and spoken those exact words. "They brought me back." For the next week, I tried to convince myself that there had to be a rational explanation. Perhaps Vincent and Daniel had both been exposed to some common cultural reference that had shaped their similar hallucinations. Perhaps there was some neurological explanation related to the specific medications used in anesthesia and the oxygen deprivation of cardiac arrest that created similar subjective experiences. Perhaps I was reading too much into what was ultimately just a strange coincidence. But I couldn't let it go. The specificity of the details, the exact matching of the timeline, Daniel opening his eyes in the white room at the same time he actually opened his eyes in the ICU, and most disturbingly, Vincent's accurate description of Daniel before Vincent could possibly have seen him or known about him. None of it made sense unless Vincent's experience during anesthesia had somehow been real. I began researching anesthesia awareness and consciousness during general anesthesia more deeply than I ever had during my nursing education. What I discovered was both fascinating and disturbing. The mechanism by which anesthesia induces unconsciousness is still not fully understood. We know that anesthetic drugs interfere with neural transmission in specific brain regions, but we don't actually know how consciousness emerges from brain activity in the first place, which means we don't truly understand what happens to consciousness when we suppress that brain activity with drugs. Some anesthesiologists and neuroscientists have theorized that consciousness might not be generated by the brain, but rather filtered or constrained by it, a concept that goes against mainstream materialism, but that would explain certain anomalies in anesthesia research. If consciousness exists in some form independent of brain activity, then suppressing brain function with anesthesia might not eliminate consciousness, but simply disconnect it from sensory input and motor output. These were troubling thoughts for someone whose entire career was built on the assumption that anesthesia simply turned off consciousness like flipping a switch. but they were the only framework I could find that even remotely accommodated what Vincent and Daniel had both described experiencing. On March 18th, 10 days after Vincent's surgery, I received a phone call at the nurses' station from a physician I didn't know. He identified himself as Dr. Lawrence Henriksen, a cardiologist from Salem Hospital, about 45 miles south of Portland. He asked to speak with me specifically, which was unusual. Doctors typically don't cold call nurses at other hospitals. "I'm calling because I have a patient who had a very unusual experience during a cardiac procedure yesterday," Dr. Henriksen said. During the consultation, she mentioned that she had a friend who recently had gallbladder surgery at Mercy General and had described a strange anesthesia experience. "My patient wanted me to reach out to see if any of your PACU nurses might remember this case, because she's deeply disturbed by some similarities in what she experienced." My heart rate increased. "What was your patient's friend's name?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Vincent Ashford," Dr. Henriksen said. "He's apparently married to my patient's sister. She said he had surgery on March 8th, and that he described being in some kind of waiting room with deceased people during his anesthesia. My patient, whose name is Grace Ashford Tennant, had what sounds like an identical experience yesterday during conscious sedation for a cardiac ablation procedure." Over the next 20 minutes, Dr. Henriksen described his patient's case to me in detail. Grace had undergone a catheter ablation for atrial fibrillation, a procedure typically performed under moderate sedation rather than general anesthesia. She had received midazolam and fentanyl for sedation and should have been in a state of relaxed consciousness throughout the procedure, able to respond to commands but not fully alert. Instead, Grace reported that shortly after receiving the sedation medications, she had found herself in a white room with chairs arranged in rows, all facing a wall that pulsed with faint blue light. She had been sitting in one of the chairs, unable to move, and had seen multiple people she recognized as deceased relatives and friends. Unlike Daniel, who had been immobilized in his chair, Grace reported that she had been able to stand up and walk around the room, examining the faces of the people sitting motionless in the chairs. The detail that had terrified Grace and prompted her request that Dr. Henriksen contact Mercy General was what she had seen when she looked at one specific person in the waiting room, a middle-aged man sitting near the back who had suddenly turned to look at her. Grace described the man as having dark hair going gray at the temples, a trimmed beard, and a distinctly anxious expression. He had looked directly at her and said, "You can see me. You're not supposed to be here yet. You're still alive." Dr. Henriksen explained that Grace had described this man's appearance in detail to her sister Claire, who is Vincent's wife. Claire had immediately recognized the description as matching Vincent and had urged Grace to contact someone at Mercy General to report the experience. "I don't know what to make of this," Dr. Henriksen admitted. "These kinds of coordinated hallucinations between related patients shouldn't be possible, particularly when they occurred under different anesthetic conditions at different hospitals. I'm wondering if there's some shared psychological or cultural element I'm missing, or if there's something else going on." I didn't know what to tell him. I couldn't explain to this cardiologist from another hospital that I had already confirmed one of Vincent's claims about a patient he had seen in the white waiting room, or that I was personally spiraling into a crisis of understanding about the nature of consciousness and anesthesia. Instead, I thanked him for calling, said I would document the information, and promised to follow up if I learned anything relevant. After ending the call, I sat at the nurse's station for a long time, staring at nothing. 3 patients now, Vincent, Daniel, and Grace, had described essentially identical experiences occurring in what sounded like the same location, even though they had been under different types of anesthesia or sedation at different times in different hospitals. The experiences weren't metaphorical or symbolic. They were specific and consistent, down to architectural details like the arrangement of chairs and the pulsing blue wall. Moreover, Vincent and Grace had seen each other in this waiting room and had been able to interact, with Vincent specifically noting that Grace was not supposed to be here yet because she was still alive. This suggested that the white waiting room was not just a hallucination, but some kind of actual place or state of consciousness that became accessible when normal brain function was altered by anesthesia or by proximity to death. That night, I barely slept. When I did sleep, I had vivid nightmares about being paralyzed in a white chair, surrounded by motionless people, unable to call for help or move or do anything except stare forward at a pulsing blue light. I woke up gasping and disoriented, and for several terrifying seconds couldn't remember whether I was in my bedroom or still trapped in that waiting room. Over the following weeks, I became increasingly dysfunctional in my work. I found myself unable to administer anesthesia pre-medication to pre-operative patients without wondering whether I was about to send them to the white waiting room. When patients emerged from anesthesia in PACU, I would lean close and ask them if they remembered anything unusual, if they had seen a white room, if they had encountered deceased people. My colleagues began noticing my strange behavior and my deteriorating performance. In early April, I was called into a meeting with Dr. Crane and the PACU nurse manager, Helen Ortega. They expressed concern about my recent performance issues and asked if I was experiencing personal problems that were affecting my ability to work. I broke down and told them everything, about Vincent's case, about discovering Daniel, about Dr. Henrikson's call regarding Grace, about my growing certainty that we were doing something terrible every time we induced anesthesia in a patient. To their credit, both Dr. Crane and Helen listened without immediately dismissing my concerns as nonsense. But they were clearly worried about my mental state. Dr. Crane gently suggested that I was experiencing burnout and possibly some form of secondary traumatic stress from years of intensive care nursing. Helen recommended that I take a medical leave of absence to rest and consider whether I wanted to continue in PACU nursing. I took their advice and went on medical leave starting April 15, 2022. During my time away from the hospital, I tried to research the white waiting room phenomenon more systematically. I searched medical literature for similar cases and found scattered reports of patients describing unusual shared experiences during anesthesia, but nothing as specific or consistent as what I had documented. I contacted researchers who studied near-death experiences and consciousness during cardiac arrest, but most of them were skeptical that anesthesia could produce genuine shared subjective experiences. In June, I made one final attempt to understand what had happened. I contacted Vincent directly through the phone number listed in his patient chart and asked if he would be willing to meet with me to discuss his experience in more detail. He agreed, and we met at a coffee shop in Beaverton on a gray, drizzly afternoon that reminded me of the morning of his surgery. Vincent looked healthy and had apparently recovered fully from his gallbladder surgery. But when he talked about his experience in the white waiting room, I could see the lasting impact it had on him. He described it with the same intensity and certainty he had shown when he first woke up in PACU. "I know what I saw," Vincent told me. "I know how impossible it sounds, but I was in that place, and everyone else there was dead. And the fact that my sister-in-law saw me there when she was under sedation a week later, that's not a coincidence. That's confirmation." "What do you think that place is?" I asked. Vincent was quiet for a long time, stirring his coffee absently. "I think it's where consciousness goes when it's disconnected from the body, but the person isn't quite dead yet. Like a waiting area between life and death. Most of the people there were fully dead, which is why they couldn't move or respond. But people like me and Grace, who were just temporarily unconscious from anesthesia, we could still move around and interact because we were coming back. And Daniel, he was in the process of dying, which is why he was stuck in that chair until they resuscitated him." "That doesn't make medical sense," I said, but my protest sounded weak even to me. "I know," Vincent said, "but it makes experiential sense. It fits with what all three of us reported. And Catherine, I need to tell you something else. Something I didn't mention to anyone at the hospital because I knew it would make me sound completely crazy." I waited, already certain that whatever Vincent was about to say would only deepen the mystery rather than resolve it. "While I was in that waiting room," Vincent continued, I walked all the way to the front where that blue pulsing wall was located. I got close enough to touch it, and when I did, I felt this overwhelming sense of finality. Like that wall was the actual boundary between life and death, and if I pushed through it, I wouldn't be coming back. And Catherine, on the other side of that wall, I could hear things, voices, not like people talking, but more like echoes of consciousness. Everyone who had ever died was on the other side of that wall, and they were still aware somehow, still experiencing something. And that terrified me more than anything else, because it meant that death isn't an ending. It's just a transition to somewhere else where we can't communicate back. I don't remember what I said in response to that. I know we talked for another hour or so, comparing details and trying to make sense of what had happened. But ultimately, there was no sense to be made. We had documented something that shouldn't be possible according to our current understanding of consciousness, anesthesia, and the nature of reality itself. I never returned to work at Mercy General. In July 2022, I submitted my resignation and accepted a position doing telephone triage for a primary care clinic, a job where I could use my nursing knowledge without ever having to put another patient under anesthesia or wonder whether I was sending them to that white waiting room. But the case still haunts me. I think about it every day. I wonder how many patients experiencing anesthesia are briefly visiting that waiting room without remembering it afterward. I wonder about all the people sitting motionless in those white chairs and whether they're aware of being trapped in that liminal space. Most disturbingly, I wonder about Vincent's description of that pulsing blue wall and what might exist on the other side of it. The medical community has no framework for what Vincent, Daniel, and Grace experienced. Anesthesia is supposed to simply suppress consciousness temporarily, not transport it to some other realm of existence. Consciousness is supposed to be generated by brain activity, not exist independently of the body in a way that could be accessed through altered states. But I know what I documented. I know that Vincent described Daniel with impossible accuracy before having any way to know about him. I know that Grace saw Vincent in the same location he had described. I know that all three patients provided consistent, specific details about a place that shouldn't exist according to everything medical science understands about consciousness. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right decision leaving PACU nursing. Maybe I should have stayed and tried to study this phenomenon more systematically, to document more cases and build a body of evidence that couldn't be dismissed. But the truth is that I couldn't continue working in a field where every time I helped put a patient under anesthesia, I was consumed by the question of where their consciousness was actually going. The case of Vincent Gregory Ashford remains for me the most unexplained and troubling experience of my nursing career. It challenged every assumption I had about consciousness, anesthesia, and the boundary between life and death. It taught me that medicine, for all its sophistication and scientific grounding, still operates with profound gaps in our understanding of the most fundamental questions about human existence. Vincent shouldn't have been able to see Daniel in the white waiting room. According to everything we know about anesthesia and consciousness, his experience should have been nothing more than a drug-induced hallucination with no connection to objective reality. But the evidence suggests otherwise. And that possibility, that consciousness persists in some form independent of brain activity, accessible through anesthesia or near-death states, is too disturbing for me to accept, but too well documented for me to dismiss. I still wake up several nights a week thinking about that white waiting room with its rows of chairs facing a pulsing blue wall. I think about all the motionless people sitting there, unable to move or communicate, and I wonder if they know they're dead. I wonder if they're experiencing time passing or if they're in some timeless state of waiting. And I wonder what happens when consciousness finally pushes through that blue wall into whatever exists beyond it. The most unsettling part of this entire experience is knowing that every day, thousands of people undergo anesthesia for surgical procedures. They're told it's safe, that they'll simply go to sleep and wake up when the surgery is finished. But what if that's not accurate? What if their consciousness is actually going somewhere during that period of induced unconsciousness? somewhere we don't understand and can't monitor with our medical equipment? I don't have answers to these questions. I'm not sure anyone does. All I know is that I can no longer participate in the administration of anesthesia without wondering whether I'm sending patients to a place we don't understand for reasons we can't explain, with consequences we haven't begun to comprehend. The impossible case of Vincent Ashford will haunt me for the rest of my life, not because of what it reveals about anesthesia or consciousness, but because of what it suggests about the fundamental nature of existence and awareness. We assume that consciousness ends with death and is suppressed by anesthesia. But Vincent's experience, validated by Daniel and Grace, suggests that consciousness might persist in ways and places we cannot currently detect or understand. That possibility terrifies me more than any medical emergency I encountered during my 14 years in the PACU. Because if consciousness persists independently of brain function, then every assumption modern medicine makes about the nature of awareness, the mechanism of anesthesia, and the meaning of death might be fundamentally incorrect. And we might be sending patients to places we don't understand every single time we inject propofol into their IV line and watch them drift into unconsciousness. I think about that white waiting room constantly, and sometimes, in the quiet moments before I fall asleep, I wonder if I'll find myself there someday, sitting in one of those white chairs, unable to move, staring at that pulsing blue wall, waiting for whatever comes next.